Kelly Sheehy and J.C. So Happy from the Homeland Project will be here to talk to show. They've got about a 20-minute professional video on pamphlets, so they'll show that and then talk about the goings on in the Homeland. The following week, the 30th, Coley, where's Coley? This project that Coley and I have been working on for a couple of years. This is an exhibit that is eventually destined for the state capitol. And it's called the Nez Perce in Oregon, Removal and Return. And we had to, this has to fit in a 10-foot by 10-foot, oh, thank you. This has to fit in a 10-foot by 10-foot space at the state capitol. And it'll be up there for, I think, 3 months sometime later this year. So we don't have it in the 10-foot by 10-foot configuration, but it will fit in 10-foot by 10-foot. And it's upstairs. And then you'll see the wall there, the Nez Perce and the Wallowas. Seth Kinsey has been working with a Nez Perce woman, Leslie Moses, who has pronounced and translated all the words on that wall. So, and we have a museum, kind of, what do you call it? A museum screen, iPad kind of thing, which Seth has arranged so that you'll have the map on it. So you can push a place on the map and say Iwatemlikin, and you'll get the correct pronunciation, the translation, and even a picture of that specific place when he's got them. And so we hope that all that will be ready, and we're going to kind of have an unveiling of it, a soft opening, if you will, on the 30th here. Okay? And then the other thing, I'm commenting just a little bit on this show. I hope you take a minute or two to look at this. This exhibit is called the Livestock Art Show. And this was an attempt to find a subject matter that was local, would appeal to local viewers as well as local artists. I think it's terrific, and I just had a call from Char Williams. Many of you know Char. She says, God, what a great show. And by the way, when are you going to do tack? I've got so much horse tack. I've got bits and this and that. And I'd love to have a place to display them. So it's really rung both with artists and with visitors. Now, it also is educational. I moved here 52 years ago. How many people can tell me what color most of the cows were in Wallowa County 52 years ago? They were red. Okay? Are they red now? They're black. Tell me how many horned cows were there in Wallowa County 52 years ago? Horned cattle. Huh? Probably none, or almost none, right? Look at the art around here now. You'll see a few you'll see a few brown cows, but mostly you'll see black cows, and then you'll see cows with horns. Now, a few years ago, I just have to tell this story. A few years ago, I taught a class in La Grande and on Northwest ecosystems, and I had Scott McLaren come in and talk to the class. So these are, 30 college juniors majoring in ag and natural resources. And Scott is describing the Snake River ecosystem and how it's changed over the years. And one of the students says, "What are you going to do about wolves?" Now, how many of you know Scott McLaren? Scott scratches his skull. I don't know, but we might have to go back to horned cattle. Anyway, so we can learn from art, and art can entertain us. And see, they're still coming in, Ian. Your fan club. So Ian Wilson, you've seen some of there are more chairs coming out there, folks. Go back in that corner. Ian Wilson is now working for Grande Ronde Model Watershed, formerly worked for Nez Perce Fisheries, and is a academically trained fish biologist. But that came later. He came here first and started selling skis. And I guess he was selling fishing gear too, so you were close to the water then, right? Anyway, that's when I first met him, when he was running the ski shop. And then when he was at Nez Perce Fisheries, he did a brown bag in here, a program on tagging fish, which was a very interesting thing. And he's moved on to beaver. Now, the old curmudgeon in the back row there, Ralph Anderson, brought a book up, and he put this book on my desk and said, "You got to read this one." And it was called Beaverland. And so I read Beaverland, and then I talked, and then I found out from other people that what Ian was doing, and we decided we'd do a program. So now I'm going to leave it to Ian, but one more interesting thing. I'm talking to a Nez Perce woman in Lapway, and I said, "I've got to go. We've got a noon program on beaver." And she said, "Oh, my cousin's Wayakin is beaver. You got to get her up there." So maybe we'll have another program on the beaver at some point. So I have one more quiz for you to think about. How many of you watched the Ken Burns program on the buffalo? Okay. And now a few of you have read Beaverland, and you're going to be more cognizant about the whole beaver story. I looked in Beaverland, and Ken Burns says that the buffalo changed and shaped the landscape of North America. And Beaverland says that the beaver shaped the landscape of North America. Okay? There's no buffalo in her index. And there are no beavers in Ken Burns' program. So the question is why these guys aren't communicating, and who's right, or are they both right, or what? Anyway, please welcome Ian Wills. So much for coming, Ian.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Rich. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's an honor to be here again and speak to everybody. It's been really just great living here the last 25 years and learning about different facets of the natural world, which we call home, and I wouldn't say I've left any of them behind, but I've just maybe embraced some of the newer, or maybe they're not new inhabitants, but as I've learned about them, I've kind of embraced them. So, Rich, I guess that was a nice introduction. So I don't know that I need to say too much more about my background. I'll just get right into the talk. And just on this intro slide here, a couple things I wanted to point out to folks that may not be aware that this is the beaver state. That's our official animal in Oregon. It's one of two states in the United States. New York is the other one. It's also a mascot of one of our universities. I guess a little bit more about myself, which is just kind of fun, is I was born to a woman named Beverly, which is derived from Beaver, that name actually. And I was born and lived and raised in Beaverton, Oregon, on a little tributary called Willow Creek, as a tributary of Beaverton Creek. So maybe it was serendipitous that this animal and I have kind of made a little bit of a pact to kind of watch out for each other. So a little bit about kind of this slide I usually use for fisheries talks, but it's still just kind of nice to orientate yourself. Columbia Basin is huge. That's the big outline. Covers a couple of countries and multiple states, and then within that we live in the kind of the area I operate in is the Grande Ronde Basin, that kind of darker gray and white area, and there's about 2,900 miles of streams in the Grande Ronde Basin that are salmonid bearing. So salmonids are fish like salmon and steelhead, bull trout, rainbow trout, and it's about 3 million acres, so pretty good sized basin. And then of course it's really important to understand this is all traditional homeland of the Nez Perce Tribe and the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Wallowa, and they had a wide-ranging area that, obviously included this area, but extended far beyond that too. And there's some cool stories, or at least one that I found online about Beaver from the Nez Perce that talks about how Beaver had, at one time there was, pines were the only trees that had fire, and essentially everybody else was pretty cold, but Beaver, being pretty clever, figured out this way to steal the fire from the pines, and then on the way of escaping from the pine trees, made this circuitous route through the Grande Ronde Valley, which is why the valley has that nice meandering shape to it. And then there's there was kind of some other parts of that story of like some trees that were left to kind of see that, or the beaver passed that fire on to some of these other species, and so it's pretty cool. I would love to hear more, Rich, from tribal members on their connections. Like, there's a lot of really good stories there. I don't feel that I'm the best person to probably talk about those, but if you do have a talk in the future, it'd be great. I know there's a lot of respect for beavers. They were seen in some tribal cultures as little people, respected for their intelligence and the way they can manipulate landscapes. So, when I first started working for the Nez Perce Tribe, there was a funny bumper sticker I saw. It was "Beaver taught salmon to jump." And I admit, it took me just a few minutes to kind of figure that out. And but it's really a great saying, because oftentimes beavers get a lot of negative connotations, and one of them being is this: there's this relationship that's not natural or healthy between fish and beavers, which there couldn't be anything further from the truth. Essentially, these two species have co-evolved for millennia, and they really do benefit each other. So I like that bumper sticker or sticker, pretty cool. So yeah, a little bit of like early history on beavers in this area. I went back to some of these records. Robert Stewart. This is an image of the Grande Ronde Valley in some kind of like early survey notes. Essentially, the Grande Ronde Valley was like a giant marsh. It was like nothing what it looks like today. It would have been inhabited by a lot of cottonwoods, and as he puts it, incredible multitudes of the furred race. Now, I guess that would have included other animals besides beaver, river otters and mink and muskrats, but certainly there would have been a large number of beavers. So it's oftentimes, we call it shifting baseline. It's really easy to just see what we see in our lifetime or even in the previous few generations, and that's kind of what we think is what is normal or what has been. And so I find it helpful to try to go back as far as you can and read as many stories to really get a better picture of what the landscape used to look like. And that's certainly what the Grande Ronde Valley would have been much different. And then this image on the left here is an early government land office map, and it's right in between Enterprise and Joseph. And then I kind of did a highlight inset, and the early government surveyors kind of identified beaver dams. And so in a moment here, I'm going to kind of paint you like a mental image of what this landscape would have looked like. But this was, from William Odell, another quote down there. There were a couple of French trappers in the county, 1864. I mean, no doubt they were obviously harvesting beaver. And this quote by William Odell is just the finest trout and salmon about in the streams. Found many Indians camped on the banks of the streams, taking great quantities of fish. It's taken me most of my career to understand fish and to think about habitat and what it would have looked like. And so these kinds of notes and stories are helpful just to fill in those gaps or paint that picture. And so beavers, they were exploited, and they were primarily exploited for the fur to make their hats. It was the felt. They have a couple of different layers of fur. They kind of have these really cool guard hairs, and they have this undercoat that's really felty, and that was used to make these hats, which were very in style at the time. And I have an actual authentic one here, thanks to the Baker family, and for loaning this picture. And it was typically Actually, that term "mad as a hatter" that came from using, there was a process used mercury to, I can't remember if it was to extract the felt, but then of course mercury is highly poisonous, and so a lot of the hatters were a little bit crazy. So if you ever wonder where the term "mad as a hatter" came from, that's where that came from. So they were heavily exploited for not only their fur, they were a currency. I mean, it was what was traded before there was really dollars. And so it drove a lot of the westward expansion of Europeans into North America and led to some of the first global monopolies in trade. That led to some intense competition from different nations, including Russia and Spain and America and, of course, Britain. And in fact, that competition was so fierce that as Hudson's Bay Company was more up into the Canada areas, but they were, of course, coming into, or they were in what now is North America, and they were trading and trapping animals. They saw the Americans were expanding westward, and and I'm pretty sure it's Peter Skeen Ogden, had a policy, a fur desert policy, and that policy was to remove all the beavers from the west before the Americans got there, so that there was no reason for them to stay, because everybody's trying to compete for this area to stake it as their own, even though, of course, it was previously inhabited. So these animals were heavily exploited. I mean, this wasn't like it was like, we'll take a few here and there and, we'll make a few bucks. It was an all-out global trade, and it literally almost from a lot of their habitats. And we still see the lingering effects of these policies today. It's a cute kid there, cute grandkid there, John, by the way. And David's in the room too. David Weaver, wherever you are, thank you for this image. I've got you some credit there. This is an early image that David Weaver shared from the Wallowa History Center, and it shows some of the early trapping and amongst those, there's different animals on that barn, but you see on the bottom the kind of rounder pelts, those were beavers. Just some of the early news, it was kind of mixed, with beavers. They were heavily exploited, and these are some of the early headlines out of those articles David shared with me. Where beaver trappers faced penalty. There was actually early closures in the first part of the 20th century. And then there looks like there was a time where they might have rebounded a little bit, and they're kind of concerned about them being too numerous. And then there was also even some early conservation efforts and recognizing the importance of what beavers are doing for the water supply. So this is just some more history on kind of like different views and kind of how the populations ebbed and flowed a little bit, and the management changed with that as well. So, all right, this is going back to that visualization exercise. In my line of work, I work on restoring streams, and one of the first things we try to do is identify what the historic conditions looked like. Not to necessarily say we're going to get them exactly back to that, but it helps to know what is possible and what kind of species we should be planting, what kind of habitats we should be creating. And so it's been a long exercise. Of most of my time initially was spent on rivers and in rivers fishing. I like to fish on my spare time, but then as a fish biologist, you're primarily in the water, and so that's where a lot of my view was. And I thought I was getting a pretty good, rich understanding of aquatic habitat, and I was certainly, but it wasn't until I got into the habitat work that I started looking around and going, wow, there's this broad floodplain that I never spend any time in, or very little time in. And I started looking at that and thinking about how that used to function, and realized how departed our current rivers are from that historic state. And you could see the old channels, you could see the relic vegetation. And I started going, wow, looks like this is a cottonwood gallery. There's a natural high terrace over here, and it would be confined only by the toe of this giant slope, this big hill right here. And so I started getting this mental image and thinking about early development, like the rail line when it came into Wallowa County, that oftentimes was laid in the lowest areas of the lowest slope. So that was oftentimes in river bottoms and along river corridors, as you can still see it today, of course. That would bisect the floodplain oftentimes. So that was some of the earliest disturbance. But I started putting this mental image together. But then every now and again, you get this little jewel, like, your neighbor will say, hey, look at this picture I've got. Steve Arment comes over, and it's taken in the early 1900s, just kind of east of Lostine, looking north, right into inside in our line of work. But you can clearly see it here. This is taken when there's no leaves on the trees, but that's just a giant cottonwood gallery that's extending all the way across the floodplain. And this is several hundred meters across, all the way to the toe of that slope. And you can also see, what's pretty interesting is these other conifers are in there, which are probably, could be spruce, pine, maybe juniper too, Rocky Mountain juniper. But this really just helps verify what this place looked like. And it was this just massive connected floodplain, and the fisheries and the biodiversity would have rivaled anywhere in the planet Earth. I mean, you would have had multiple species of salmon returning. You would have had just an untold amount of songbirds and all kinds of animals that are chasing those, all that ecosystem function. And that would have been all across this area too. That would have been, in the upper valley, all of our rivers looked like that. And they look much different today. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're ever just wondering kind of what this place was like. It was a paradise filled with this wonderful source of protein that came back to you every year. So a little bit about beavers. And some of these numbers might be just a little off. There's 24 extinct genre. Fossil records in Oregon go back 7 million years. There's some in Germany, 10 to 12 million years ago. There used to be a giant beaver that was the size of a small bear. And that's a kind of a rendering of that on the right there, with a current size of like a North American beaver. And that would have been pretty interesting. There's two... they had some different habits, though. Apparently, they don't think they were dam builders, and I don't think they felled trees, so they were just eating a lot of vegetation, I guess. But there's two extant species, so two existing species. There's Castor canadensis, which is the one we see in North America, and then there's Castor fiber, which is over in Europe. Historic population estimates range from 60 to 400 million, and I had a really good question from a friend of mine at another talk I did on kind of where those estimates came from, and they are, they're probably based a lot on trapping records, I would imagine, but it was certainly an estimate. And then today's, hence the large range, and today's population estimate is 6 to 12 million. So even though they're kind of on the rebound, they're a fraction of what they used to be historically in terms of being on this landscape. And so what does that range look like? This image on the left is the North American range. It's basically everywhere, except for maybe some of the driest places, and way down in Florida. And apparently, I don't know, they didn't go too far in Mexico. And then over on the right bottom panel there, that's the fiber species over in Europe, and they would have been spread out throughout that country as well. So this is just to point out that these animals were, incredible at exploiting habitats. That's a huge variety of habitats. I didn't put it on here. There's a local population down in Tierra del Fuego in South America. They're not native there. They were introduced for trade, but they're causing some issues down there. So it's not part of their native range. Oops. I did go. So I was going to play good. So the biology, a little bit about the biology, which is really kind of, these animals fascinate me the more I get to learn about them. They're just, they weren't studied real well because they were exploited, and then it's hard to study them when there's not a lot around, or there's not seen to be a good value in them. Beavers will mate for life more often than not. They live in family groups and lodges and bank dens. And they do not reproduce like rodents, despite that term, even though they are in the rodent family. They have evolutionary adaptations that allow them to fell trees and eat and see underwater. So they have a nictitating membrane that essentially acts like goggles when underwater. They have a second set of lips inside their mouth so they can eat underwater. These are some crazy, when I think about them as a biologist, I'm just like, these are some crazy adaptations. Never mind the fact they have iron in their teeth, which makes sense, so they can chew trees down. Think about that for a second. I mean, an animal that chews a tree down. So a lot of really cool, significant evolutionary adaptations that allow them to do things that a lot of other animals can't. I could go on and on about some of that stuff, but and castor's been used in food products and medical treatments for thousands of years. So their value it does extend beyond just their fur, and it's been used for a lot of other reasons as well.
So you're talking about castor oil.
Castoreum, yeah, it's a oil produced from their glands back in their backside. I'll just say that for maybe, I don't know, maybe being nice, I guess. And those were just a couple of beavers there, just a pair. And it's kind of funny. There was a great blue heron in that shot, and then they gave that great blue heron a tail slap. So they were just kind of interacting, doing their thing. Beavers, why are they interesting? They build dams. I mean, that's one reason. And dams back up water and sediment and create a lot of habitat for a ton of other species, including ourselves. They build lodges, like this one in the middle image here. Lodges are interesting because beavers don't hibernate. They go into those lodges in the wintertime, and they have dry places in there, and they can have their young and their family groups, and they can feed each other. And there's kind of a rendering up in the upper right there of what those lodges look like. They usually have underwater entrances so they can swim into those in safety. I don't know if anybody's seen a beaver on land, but they're kind of funny looking. They look like a little T-Rex or something. They've got these big back, strong hind legs, and they've got these little tiny front legs. But however awkward they are on land, they make up for it in the water. They're just absolutely graceful when they're swimming, and that's how they really survive and have survived for millions of years. And this is a little lower right image. I had to put that on there. This is a female, like a mom with her kits. Baby beavers are called kits, and they're very nurturing to their young. Oftentimes they'll stay in the lodge for a couple of years before they'll disperse, and they'll help take care of the next generation of kits. So this is all to kind of help reframe the picture of beavers you might have understood or thought you did when you see them fall a tree on your property. And beavers use tools. This is something in biology that for a while we like to kind of reserve for species like ourselves and primates and certain species like birds like New Caledonia crows. Tool use is essentially when you can create something like this beaver did with that peeled stick, and then it put that stick into place so that they could stand on that to get greater leverage to chew on this tree. That's considered a higher intelligence because it's doing a couple different things with the tool it made, and then it's put it in place to get to another part of that tree. So clearly there's intelligence there. All right, so you heard me talk about beavers. It's easy for me to do. You might be kind of going, maybe that's all you're here for, and we can chat more after this. But there's a broader picture here on why they're important and why they're significant, and it relates back to my job in stream restoration. And this image on the left here is a channel evolution model, is what it's called, by Kluwer and Thorne. And essentially this just kind of is what streams would look like in a model form, with the top one being a stage 0 where the floodplain's connected at very low flows, and then how it gets degraded over time, and you can see that channel gets incised, and pretty soon you're kind of looking down at your channel. And I challenge all of you in this room, go out to any river anywhere, pretty much in the world, but anywhere there's certainly been humans, and look at that river and do that test. Just go up to the edge of that river, and are you looking at the river at your feet, or are you looking down at the river? If you're looking down at the river, that river's incised, and it's probably heavily departed from historic conditions and disconnected from its floodplain. And that likely was the cause of some human activities, whether it was infrastructure, it was channelization. There's several different factors that have led to that condition. But this model is really helpful for us in planning restoration projects to understand where we are and where we want to get to, depending, of course, on a lot of other factors. The image on the right is, I don't know exactly what creek that is. I think it might be Catherine. But it's in the Grande Ronde Basin, and this is kind of more typical of what you see, unfortunately. You see that steep bank there on the left side of the image, and of course there's not a lot of water left in that shot there, but that is unfortunately more typical than not. And so with the help of beavers, they do the same things essentially that I do, but much better and much cheaper. And they help grade this habitat. They help build it back up so we can get away from those incised channels, connect our floodplains, and store water and store sediment. Essentially, what we've created and on our landscapes is really effective ways to convey our water out of this county. It's like I tell anybody that I work with, it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is. If you want to effectively convey your water out of the county, keep it straight and keep it simple. If you want to hang on to your water and your sediment longer, connect your floodplain. So we'll get back to more on why beavers and how they can help us as partners doing that. These are a couple images of reference reaches are really hard to find. There are some here, of course. You have to go up into the wilderness. Even when you're up there, you have to remind yourself there used to be, 100,000. I mean, there were so many sheep, completely altered the landscape back in the day. There was splash dam logging. So even when you think you're in a reference reach, you better dig deep and try to look into the history, or you might be able to see it right there in the landscape. But these conditions have rebounded quite a bit. These are in the upper Bynum here by Elk Creek. This is Elk Creek here on the left. You can see the wood loading in there, and that might kind of scare some people, but streams are supposed to have wood in them. We were good at taking wood out for a long time. We thought that's what we needed to do, but that wasn't a good idea. Upper Naha's a good reference reach, and there's a few other examples around here too. All right, well, what does the research say? You've heard me talk about beavers and how they can help us as partner in stream restoration. The research is unanimous, and this little panel here on the left just talks about they create more diverse habitats and ecosystems, increase biodiversity, promote salmon trout recovery, and these are all cited too. They're not just like somebody came up with these. Regulate stream flows, improve water quality, replenish drinking water aquifers, stabilize the water table, repair eroded stream banks, restore watershed health. They're on par with, for ecosystem function like rainforests and coral reefs on the planet Earth. So really important habitats. And then some research I have to go through because I know some of us really like it. I do. Eurasian beaver activity increases water storage, attenuates flow, and mitigates diffuse pollution from intensively managed grasslands. I met Mr. Puttock over at this beaver conference last fall, and he's doing some great research over in Europe. And it turns out those European beavers are doing the same thing that the North American ones are doing. Good things. You heard about Smokey the Bear? I know you all have. Well, Dr. Fairfax introduced us to Smokey the Beaver, because Beaver Dam River riparian corridors stay green during wildfires throughout the western USA. This is research, folks. Not my opinion, but an image is worth 1,000 words. So this is the bootleg fire. Those are beaver dam complexes, and I don't need to tell you anything. You can see what happened to that landscape and what survived. So she's been doing some great research. She's now in Minnesota, I think University of Minnesota. But on beavers, the effects of beaver wetlands and these really intense wildfires we're having. And they're the only place where some life survives, some of these fires. So they're important on several levels. Some more papers here. Beavers, North American Freshwater Climate Action Plan. And this one, Chris Jordan and Dr. Fairfax and Dr. Jordan, they talk about riverscape resilience and how a lot of things that beaver ponds and complexes do to reduce erosion and store carbon and all these features versus these areas without beavers. The study on the right, Beavers Nature's Ecosystem Engineers, kind of gives you a little better image of kind of that early channelized stream I was talking about and kind of what happens over time through the work that beavers do and how that sediment storing builds up, and then of course the water goes around that, and then they dam those, and then it builds up and it builds up, and that's a way that beavers are able to reconnect floodplains, and we can do that ourselves as well. But again, I sleep at night. These guys usually don't. They like to be active at night, and it's just a lot easier. I have to get a lot of permits, and these guys are able to just do their job without all that baloney. So it's not all baloney, but it feels like it sometimes. And don't be mistaken by, a lot of folks are like, well, yeah, okay, Ian, you like beavers and you think we should have them, but these things really cause all these problems. Well, it turns out there is a ton of studies of people on working lands and ranches that have found that working with beavers in very arid landscapes, and well, any landscape, but a lot of good examples in arid landscapes, is very beneficial. This is ranchers and beavers understanding the human dimensions of beaver related stream restoration in western rangelands, and they looked at 3 different areas, 3 big ranches in California, Nevada, and Oregon, and a lot of the benefits, some of them, the benefits for fish and wildlife, but then you get into, the increased soil deposition, reduced stream bank erosion, and there's of course there's increased forage because you have green forage longer. You don't need to have to irrigate that land, and then you can see this just again a nice image here on the bottom of the same spot, but managed completely differently. One of them is no fences and just kind of whatever type of a pretty open grazing plan, I guess you would say, and the one on the right is welcoming beavers back and intensively managing that grazing. So it can make a huge difference, and these folks have found that. And just a few more. I mean, there's so much out there. If you want more research, I've got piles of it. But field experiments to assess the passage of juvenile salamanders across beaver dams during low flow conditions in a tributary to the Klamath River. This is really important because this still comes up even amongst my professional colleagues. And it's not that beavers can't potentially make a dam that's a barrier to fish, but it's the bigger picture question that these species have co-evolved together. So it's not as if they clearly wouldn't have worked. If beavers damming was detrimental to fish, you would see beavers in one area and you'd see fish in another, but you don't see that. They overlap completely because those dams are ephemeral. They more or less change the distribution and the timing of fish sometimes, but they definitely don't block them. So some of the findings in some our studies suggest beaver dams, BDAs, and other channel-spanning habitat features should be preserved and restored rather than removed as perceived obstructions to fish passage. And then a study over here on the right, over in Bridge Creek, for those of us who've been over in Central Oregon, it's over in that Mitchell area. And ecosystem experiments reveals benefits of natural and simulated beaver dams to threaten population of steelhead. So they saw all kinds of cool stuff with increased size and survival of juvenile steelhead. So this is just the hard research that just shows that these animals work well together. Oh, one more just because I had to, I guess. The persistence of, and it's Dr. Wool, the persistence of beaver-induced geomorphic heterogeneity and organic carbon stock in the river corridors. That's why I didn't want to put it in there. That's a mouthful, but let's just go right to one of the abstracts. These results also indicate that the effects of beaver ecosystem engineering can persist for nearly 3 decades after the animals largely abandon a river corridor. That's powerful. I mean, not only do these animals have a huge impact when they're there, they have a huge impact. It's so big that it's for 3 decades later, you're still seeing the benefits. So, pretty cool stuff. So, all right, we talked about the good, and I know that because beavers are these mischievous, hard-working, intelligent animals, they're going to do some things that we don't always agree with. And that the first and foremost is they chew and fell trees. And most of the time, if they're in their own habitats, that may not be a problem. But oftentimes, this is areas where we live, or they're trees that we like. Maybe they're very important to us. Somebody in our family planted them, or we just don't want to see them. We want to see them standing, perhaps. But there's ways, fortunately, to mitigate that. And this happy-looking guy here, he's painting a mixture of paint and sand on this aspen tree. And beavers don't like the kind of the grit of the sand, so that will kind of prevent them from chewing on trees. And then a real effective way, too, is to just use like a wire mesh, and you wrap a tree. Of course, there's a right way to do it to leave enough room for that tree to grow. But then, of course, beavers won't be able to get through that wire mesh. So, again, so if they do something you don't like, there's ways to mitigate that for the tree felling. And sometimes they'll get into like certain areas, if you have crops, they can get into those, especially like maybe an orchard that happens in Southwest Oregon. Some of my colleagues working down there have come up with some very creative ways to keep beavers out. And it's kind of reminds me of like cattle. They're just little short electrical fences. You get them close to the ground, and the beaver goes up there and thinks it's going to get in there into your orchard and gets zapped. And it's like, oh, no thanks. So there's ways to protect those, and there's a lot of grants out there right now, and for folks to pursue those kind of materials. And I'm also just finishing up some training right now to help folks locally here with different types of mitigation strategies and to learn to live with beavers. But actually, probably the biggest thing that beavers do is that causes problems is blocking road culverts. road culverts to a beaver are essentially like, oh, wow, look at this. I just have to plug this one tiny hole, and then I've got this giant roadbed for a dam. Like, that was easy. And so they love to do it, and then they've created just a ton of habitat in real short order. But, of course, the highway departments don't like it. People don't like it if you can't get through a road and get to where you need to go. But there's some really creative folks on the East Coast. Mike Callahan, who I took my training through, and Skip Lyle earlier, who've come up with all kinds of great devices you can install on road culverts that allow those to function. And it's kind of funny because essentially you have to trick the beaver. Like, this is called the Keystone Culvert over here on the right. And essentially the beaver will build on that fence. But as they build, they'll build further away from the culvert, and they never actually block it up. It just flows over that and over the fence and goes down the culvert. And so then they're kind of like, well, I don't know, we did our job. We put some sticks in here, but apparently it's not working, and they just move on. So it's a very creative, highly effective way of just tricking beavers, essentially. And there's some different looking ones that you can use, but that's another some of the training that I'm getting to help folks here.
Is that what they call beaver deceiver?
Yeah, that's kind of a general term. I was actually Skip Lyle. His company's called Beaver Deceiver, and so that he uses that more generally, I think, to talk about a lot of different methods he uses to trick beavers. And so, but yes, sometimes it's used to talk about culverts, culvert fencing. There's different ways you can do that too. This is another real common one here. I better get rolling here. This one is a pond leveler, and this is another way. Essentially, you just trick beavers. They're always like trying to build up dams to store water, and so you just essentially put a pipe in a cage in the pond, and then you put it out through their dam. And then that, whatever level you put that at, you want to put it at a level where you don't lower the water too much so beavers can still live there, but it doesn't get too high to where it's causing property damage or concerns. So the beavers are kind of like, well, I don't know, I guess the dam looks good, and then they just live or they move on. And again, highly effective. And so this is again something training I'm receiving, and so this will be available to folks here soon. So. And then relocation is the last resort. Anybody that's worked with animals knows that when you handle animals, it's usually a pretty stressful event for the animal. It's kind of hard to do, especially an aquatic animal. And so I went up to the Methow country with another colleague here, and we learned they've been relocating beavers for they've been around for at least 14 years, and I think the bulk of their tenure. They started relocating beavers down in the Methow Valley. If any of you have been up there in North Cascades, and they essentially said, we got all these beavers in the Methow and the Chinook, and let's just, the people don't like them or they're causing problems. Let's just take them, put them up in these tributaries. And it gets really steep there really fast. And it sounded like a good idea, but you can imagine the beavers just you put them up there, and they would get preyed upon because they're in a totally new habitat and they're trying to move around and figure out what the heck's going on, or they just come right back down into the main valley because that's where they wanted to be. So since then, Methow, we learned from those folks, they've kind of 180'd their philosophy, and they've said, hey, let's go to a coexistence and try to work with people where these beavers want to be rather than trying to relocate them. But we learned a lot from them on just how to live trap a beaver. There's this big trap. It's like this giant wire cage, it's called a Hancock trap, and it's really kind of sketchy to set. And it looks like it just sandwiches the beaver in there. And then you have to take them and either relocate them immediately, or more often than not, you need to hold them in order to try to relocate them with their mate. Because if you take them away from their mate, they're going to really screw some things up. And so you have to try to you have to pair them up if they're a single beaver, because they do much better if they're paired up. Or alternatively, you catch a whole family. So you can see why relocating beavers and catching them alive is not an easy process. Something we're going to probably only use as a last resort. But it would be better, I feel like, still to be able to try to relocate a beaver alive and give it a shot versus if you knew the other option was lethal trapping. Because they are pretty hardy animals, and they would at least have a chance to make it. So.
Ian, just real quick, early relocation of beaver in the county. My dad was born back in 25 and grew up on Confederated Tribes
Yeah.
country and down below the Dorrance property. And the issue for the farmers, ranchers, were not the dams per se, but when they burrowed into the ground, because county predominantly in the twenties and thirties, early forties was still large horses, and the horses would, or cattle, would fall through their tunnels and break a leg, and you had to destroy the stock. And so government trappers would come, trap them, and try to relocate beaver. So it was they did that roughly 100 years ago here in the county. We relocate beaver.
That's really cool. That's a good story. Yeah, it's interesting how the conservation and idea behind beavers has shifted over time, and it's hasn't always been a negative perception. And actually, I think I had that in an earlier slide. I didn't really talk about that, but the canals they dig, that's really a big impact on the riparian floodplain in terms of benefits. They dig those to have a watery canal to get to more food resources oftentimes, but that creates this more connected floodplain. It's very similar to what hippopotamuses do out in Africa. They dig these like canals, and that spreads that water out in those real dry areas. But I can see where that'd be a problem if you had livestock, or if you stepped in them yourself. It's scary. You'll go down a couple feet and you didn't even see it. So yeah, I can see where that'd be challenging. That's a good, interesting story though, and how they were relocating them. And then I guess it's worth mentioning too quickly in terms of relocation. One of the most famous relocation efforts was done by Idaho Fish and Game. They actually took beavers and recognized their importance. They put them in these wooden crates and they parachuted them into the Frank Church wilderness back in the 40s and 50s. And there was a male beaver called Geronimo, and he was the test pilot, I guess, if you will, and our test jumper. And he had to jump so many times that the story goes that towards the end they'd open the box up and he'd just load up in it because he knew that that's what he was supposed to do. But they're very successful. The beavers, all of them, these boxes, can you imagine a crate coming down when you're in the wilderness with a parachute and it hits the ground, explodes, and out pops a beaver? I mean, I would definitely question what I was eating. Yeah, they were pretty successful. Only one beaver that they know of had perished, had gotten out of its box somehow and it jumped before it got to the ground. But that was, so people have been moving around for a while, recognizing that importance, So stream restoration, to restore natural processes and attract beavers. We build beaver dam analogs. This one's kind of a pretty big example, but essentially it's just a human-made beaver dam, which is made to serve the same purpose as what beavers do in terms of storing sediment and water and creating a lot of those good habitats. And actually we had help from Wallowa resource interns here on this one, which was really good. So Wallowa resource has been helping us out a lot. And then on the right, so I got a heck of a glare. That's right. That's a Beaver Lodge analog. We've been trying some of those out, but it turns out so far the beavers, they didn't really like that one. They just built their own lodge, so we're still learning there.
Are you seeing beaver come back when you do these restorations?
Yes, we are. We're starting to see that more, I think, as we're getting better at restoring rivers and connecting the floodplains. We've kind of learned a lot in the last 20 or 30 years, and we're starting to recognize, I guess, not only the importance as a partner, but to really try to build these projects to recruit them to take over that long-term stewardship. So, as my wildlife colleagues would often say, they'd say, Ian, this isn't a beaver problem, it's a habitat problem. If you had the habitat, you'd have all kinds of beavers. And I kind of resisted that because I'm like, well, why can you see them in downtown Martinez, California, and downtown Missoula, Montana, and downtown Pendleton, Oregon? And you're telling me in Wallowa County we don't have enough habitat out here? I mean, that didn't line up. But what was very true about that was that they need a lot of watery habitat, and we don't have a lot of that. Our habitat's been very simplified. So if you can create that for them, ponds and more connected floodplains where they can get to that vegetation to eat and survive, and they oftentimes do show up. This is a cool study that I learned in this Beaver Corps training with Mike Callahan. They did a big study. This is out in Massachusetts, and essentially was about 9 years and 55 beaver conflict sites. And it turns out that it's a lot cheaper to learn to live with these animals than it is to lethally trap them. So that's really an important selling point for me when I'm talking to folks and they're interested in trying to learn to live with beavers versus just removing them. Problem is, if beavers are on your place, they're there for a reason because you have the habitat they want, and so they're going to be back. And so you're better off learning to live with them than to try to say, I just don't want them here, because you're going to over and over and over again, you're going to be removing them. And this is I love this slide. This took me a long time to put together. I've been tracking, my wife and I did a big restoration project on our place in the Wallowa River, and one of our primary goals was to attract beavers. And I was happy to say after 2 months they came back. Then they kind of disappeared for a little while, and then they came back, and they've been there. But the wildlife explosion and biodiversity that you see, and this is just why we're trying to film primarily beavers, is unbelievable. It's bobcats, it's minks, it's bear, it's mule deer, every migratory waterfowl species you can think of. And oftentimes they're there in part because of the habitat we created, but certainly it's the disturbance the habitat beavers create, because I'm just filming oftentimes a very narrow window of where the beavers are, and we're seeing a lot of these animals right in that particular habitat. So coho salmon, Chinook salmon, steelhead spawning, it's all connected. And of course the great blue heron, they seem to have good fun with each other. So how can you help? Some of the things we've been doing here the last couple of years, we've developed an iNaturalist, or on iNaturalist, we developed a Northeast Oregon beaver survey. You can get on there. So basically a community science effort to identify beaver observations. We have a kind of a whole protocol you can go through just to learn how to go through that process. It's very simple though. Essentially you just download the app and iNaturalist on your phone, and you take pictures of when you see beaver sign if you're out hiking or fishing or bird watching, and then you can record these observations and upload them to the Northeast Oregon Beaver Project. This helps us get an idea of where they are in the landscape, and for just better management and understanding. And then of course you can obscure those locations so it doesn't make them a target for folks. So that's something we started about 3 years ago. We have over 130 observations. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. There's been some good support and good input there. We also developed a Northeast Oregon Beaver Working Group, and that was to address trying to get the data out of silos, work together as partners and share that data, to work on what we're going to do to coexist, and the training that I've been taking, and education outreach like this talk today, and also working with partners on low-tech stream restoration like beaver dam analogs. Oh, and relocation was another one too, another aspect we were working on there. So. And that's supported by a lot of different partners, and we're still meeting and have several subgroups. So some of the challenges, you can't just install these structures or build BDAs without permits in most situations. So that's kind of a challenge. I mean, you have to understand that we have a lot of migratory fish, and you need to work within the regulations and fish passage rules in the state. There's a lack of consistency between regulating agencies sometimes, and states certainly. That's more relevant, I guess, if you're going to go across state lines. But there's a lot of opportunities for incentives and things to try to help folks to maybe even get some kind of credits for some of this work as well. So I think we're getting close. That was it. So if beavers build it, they will come. Questions? Anybody? You want me to hand the mic out, DJ, or what's the best way?
The
Or
best
have
way
people
for questions is for you to step out a little more in front and center so more folks can see it.
Don't get
And
blinded by the
then
light.
pass the mic for questions. We'll run that microphone.
You didn't exactly say this, Ian, but I'm guessing that from what you're saying, that the Grande Ronde Model Watershed is employing and deploying this strategy as part of their stream restoration, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess it's kind of. Yeah, thank you, Eleonora. Good point. I am employed by the Grande Ronde Model Watershed, and a lot of this work I do is under that umbrella. It's in complete recognition that, I think supporting beavers on the landscape is a valuable tool in stream restoration, in addition to the more traditional methods we'll use with hiring contractors and restoring streams. So, yeah, most definitely, my boss is very supportive of that, that kind of understanding and marriage of those philosophies, just basically nature's stream engineers working with them. Ida?
Can you talk about specifics in Wallowa County, which areas have been made back into beaver habitat, which areas are being worked on, what are the plans for the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's certain areas in private properties which I wouldn't mention specifically to respect out of privacy that beavers have come back to, which is really encouraging. I guess it's really worth mentioning, Ida, that understanding beavers in Wallowa County, there were some trapping closures quite a while ago. Some of them I think are 40 years old or longer, but they were all from the forest boundary and up on the major tributaries of the Wallowa River, so Hurricane Creek, Lostine, and Bear Creek. It turns out I think that was done with good intentions, but maybe not the best understanding of their habitat needs, because there's not really a lot of beavers in those areas. There's also not a lot of really good habitat for beavers. They like low velocity, so slow water, lots of riparian trees. That would have been where we like to live as well, down in this valley historically. They probably would have went the other way. They would have been here, and they would have dispersed up into the mountains. So we're looking at trying to restore habitats in those low velocity habitats where people are, and kind of create these like safe places for beavers to reproduce and as they can disperse. And I'd say that's primarily it. There's a lot of different habitats on other parts of the forest and other areas of the county too. We're working out in Chesanim Creek to do a lot of restoration out there. There's some landowners that are on board with that and living with beavers, so that's a big focus there. Pretty much every project I do, when I work with landowners, that's one of the first questions I'll ask them is that, how do you feel about beavers? Because this project we create is going to attract beavers, and if you don't want them there, it would definitely sway my opinion whether or not I wanted to work with somebody, because it doesn't make any sense to create habitat to attract an animal in that's going to create even more habitat and then get rid of them. So that's, I guess, some of our focus is generally wherever they want, wherever we can kind of encourage them to be, but it's oftentimes the habitats they prefer to be in, which is these kind of low-lying areas, low slope areas.
Do you have a feel for in Wallowa County, do we have like a dozen beavers or 100 or 200, or is in your current,
Yeah, that's a good question, Sally, right? Good question. And no, we don't in terms of like a robust scientific number, because it turns out they'd be a little tricky to get a population estimate on. It'd have to be pretty intensive. You need to do some kind of like tagging effort, monitoring effort. There's just not the funds and the interest there. And I mean, not that there's maybe not the interest, maybe it's more of a funding thing. Based on the presence, which can be deceiving because they leave a lot of sign. I would say it's probably, if I could guess, I suppose, but it's probably in the hundreds or something of that nature from what I've seen tromping all over this county. It's certainly not anything what it would have been historically. Yeah, it would have been historically. Couldn't have probably walked almost anywhere in any of these streams unless they're extraordinarily high gradient without seeing some kind of beaver sign. And now it's like I can think about most of them on the top of my head. I'm sure there's ones I don't know about, but I mean, so yeah, pretty low.
I don't need it. I spent some time in Portland and kayaking in the Columbia Slough, which is kind of the old floodplain of the Columbia River, and there are beaver in there. So we're talking industrial areas, scrubland kind of areas, mixed urban, and there's a lot of beaver in there. But I've never seen a beaver dam. I see them felling trees. I can't get inside the head of a beaver. What's it doing if it's not building a dam?
OPB, Oregon Field Guide, just had a cool special on the Columbia Slough, and they're talking about all the wildlife in there, and it's kind of a history. That was really cool. It was just this last Thursday. That's always comes up a lot of times. Like, are there beavers that build lodges, or the ones that just build, bank dens? And it really, what it boils down to is just think of them as this graceful, Michael Phelps, if he ate a lot of cheeseburgers, but they are the most graceful swimmers you've ever seen. But out in land, they're very vulnerable. So what they really need is water. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a dam to create that water. It can be a lake. It can be like the project on our property was we did a channel fill section, which just created a lot of connected base flows. And the beavers moved right into that and started chewing trees down without even building any dams. So it really has more to do with, do they have the aquatic habitat they need to avoid predation? Because that's the key. And if they're out on land, they're very vulnerable. But if they're out in the middle of some deep water, there's just no way a cougar is going. I shouldn't say there's no way, but it's very unlikely they're going to be able to catch them in that scenario. So more to do with the amount of water, the depth to build their homes and reproduce and access food. You bet.
Why do beavers leave a landscape?
Yeah, Elnora, they'll leave a landscape if they exhaust the food sources, which can happen, because they do have a healthy appetite. I can tell you these animals are big. If you have not seen a full-grown mature beaver, we're talking 40, 50, 60 pounds, and they're just solid. It's not like they're long and lean. And so if they exhaust the food source, they'll typically just move on somewhere else to try to find additional food. And the good thing is, it's not that it goes away. They cut stems like willows, and oftentimes those will branch out into multiple stems. So it's really a good strategy to kind of harvest a bunch. Maybe you're like, okay, we got to move on. But then when they come back, they've got a whole bunch more willows that have grown back up in that place. So that's oftentimes why they'll leave a landscape, or if they're preyed upon or trapped, pretty heavily persecuted, they'll probably leave a habitat too.
When we were recently over on the west side, we were shown, I don't remember what it was called. It was like this little pile that the beaver made at the edge that they would then mark with their scent glands or something. You know what I'm talking about? Can you tell me more about that?
It's coming back to the castoreum. That stuff is useful for a lot of purposes. It's like their form of communication. So yeah, they do these really cool scent mounds. And they grab these little T-Rex arms, and they grab a bunch of mud and leaves and stuff, and they put them in these mounds, and then they'll walk over the top of them. They'll mark them with their castor, both males and females, but more often than not, males they like to do that, as you can imagine. And that serves for several purposes. One, it's for rival beavers that might be coming around, and they can go, oh, okay, this place is already occupied. They've had their warning. Or it also could be a communication maybe for a potential mate, like, hey, I'm in this habitat. If somebody else is around. So it's a form of communication. That's a really cool smell too. If you ever get a chance, put your nose right down one of those scent mounds. It's kind of you hear motor oil, vanilla. It's really kind of cool. I find myself putting my nose in there, but I'm just curious. But yeah.
So, I've got a lot of questions. So, beavers as food. In Beaverland, she talks about some of the tribes that did eat beaver. How widespread was that? And also, I think the trappers at some point, wasn't there, the beaver tail was valued for a food source?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So definitely a food source. I've heard it's really really good. I haven't eaten any myself. But maybe someday, who knows? If we have enough beaver, I'll try one. But the tail was apparently prized by fur trappers because it was really fatty. And they say it was prized, but to me that sounds more like a survival strategy. Like they were half starving in the middle of winter, and they discovered something that just had a lot of fat in it, so they could basically survive. But yeah, that tail also serves to like thermoregulate for beavers. It has some cool functions. They can exchange heat with it. And they also store nutrients in it, the beaver itself, and kind of can pull out of that as well, pull nutrients. So, I think as a food, I've heard they're pretty good. Rich, I don't know, we'll have to try one someday.
How did you distinguish the wife? If you caught the male, how did you know which one was his wife? Is there just one couple in a dam, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so I did not. Sexing beavers is actually pretty hard. Their genitals are kind of mostly internal, and so and we didn't. I never handled any beavers. They showed up on our place, but just understanding their biology, they're very territorial. So when you see two beavers we have them on film. Actually, it looks like they're actually mating. But when you see them and they're grooming each other and they're hanging out in very friendly circumstances, it seems very obvious that they're a mated pair. If they weren't, if it was like two male beavers, they probably wouldn't be getting along too well, unless they were like litter mates or something, younger litter mates or something of that nature. But when they're just two and they're both adults, and they're getting along and they're doing things like, one's mounting the other and they're grooming each other. It seems like they're kind of in love. So that was the determination. But yeah, they did not sex them. I guess you can use their castor. Coming back to that, that's one of the things you can use to smell. I haven't done that, but I guess it's pretty difficult though. It's definitely not easy to tell.
Do we have trappers in the county now? Is there a market for beaver still? No?
There is there are trappers here. The price of pelts is really low, so there's not a lot of motivation to trap them. I think most of the times they get calls to be trapped just for people that are concerned about something that I've been talking about. Trees are being felled, or they're concerned about damage to their property, flooding, that kind of thing. There's a government trapper, and there's at least a couple private trappers. And then there's probably some that are operating under the radar or under the law too. I'm sure of that. So.
I know you don't want to talk about who has beavers on their properties, but how many property owners is Grande Ronde Model Watershed working with on beavers?
Do you want to repeat that, DJ, or is that?
Either that or if you can repeat the question.
Sure. So yeah. So Eleanor was asking, being sensitive to beavers on private property. You're wondering how many beavers are out there. The Grande Ronde Model Watershed is working with. Is that more or less how many landowners? Well, yeah. It's a good question. When I say, if I'd frame it as working with, it'd be like, if you had some beavers on your property, Eleanor, and you're like, wow, this is really needy, and what can I do to encourage these animals? I would come out and I would talk to you, and I'd tell you maybe we could do something to encourage them to stay. And that, I guess, so it could look different ways. It's not, it's usually a lot of outreach, I guess, working with folks. And sometimes it's a long relationship of going from, hey, I don't know about these animals, what should I do to get rid of them, to maybe you should rethink about what they're doing, and then over time that kind of becomes, hey, don't even think about letting this trapper come on my property, and if you're doing some tour with the trapper, don't even think about it. I really love these animals. So there's a lot of outreach, and I don't know that number off the top of my head. I'd say here locally, there's just not that many private properties with beavers. I can think of at least a couple right off the top of my head really quickly. 3 for sure. But basically, it's everybody we work with. It's part of the conversation with myself and our partners and stream restoration. So then it goes into the dozens of projects moving forward too. And then, of course, on the Union County side, it's a very similar effort over there.
Well, it's after 1, and we probably ought to let some people might have to get back to work or to napping or something. That was a hell of a presentation.
Oh, thanks, Rich.